Hi, I'm Glen Harrison, Director at Sigma Assessment Systems, and I'm here to talk to you about our simple succession planning process. Succession planning can be a really intimidating process for some, but it doesn't have to be. The purpose of the webinar today is to add some structure and provide some tools to take a little bit of the intimidation factor out of your succession process. So today we're going to talk about a few different things. Number one, identifying where to focus your resources. Determining the talent that you need for the future success of your organization, selecting those successors and high potentials to move into those roles, assessing the gaps between the talent you have and the talent you need, executing a plan for developing that talent, and finally measuring and communicating success. And this is a really important thing that we'll finish up with the session a little bit later, but measuring and communicating that success is going to help build momentum for your process and also get some buy-in from your executive team. So the most frequent question we get when I do workshops around the country is, where do I start? As I said, succession planning can be a really intimidating process, but again, it doesn't have to if you have the right resources and you have a structured process. The best place to start is to essentially getting key stakeholders in a room and discussing where to focus those resources and where our most immediate needs are. We do this with a great tool, and it's a very long name, our Critical Role Identification Questionnaire, and it's a great tool to basically list the positions that you need succession for and really focusing on which ones are the most important. Identifying those critical roles, we use a relatively simple questionnaire, and essentially to use this, you would list all the important positions that you need to have successors for. Many find it really easy to list their management team, specifically senior managers, but I would challenge you to always include a non-manager role at your organization. Every organization has that individual that's super critical to the day-to-day business operations. They may not necessarily be in a senior management role. So challenge yourself. If you don't have one of those individuals listed, you're probably missing out on someone. Next, once we've listed those positions, we have our succession management team or our senior management team essentially rate the relative importance of each of those areas. And essentially they're along 5 different areas. So how urgent is the need? The urgency of the need is simply, is the individual expected to be leaving either through retirement, moving into another role sometime soon? So if the need is urgent, that would be a high rating. Secondly, what does the external candidate availability look like? So could we replace this person with someone outside the company relatively soon? Or are we aware of someone at one of our competitors, someone in a similar role, maybe at an organization in the city that we're in? So what does that external candidate availability look like? Next would be the internal candidate availability. So how many people within the organization would be in a position to move into this role today? And we would rate that. Next, and this should be an obvious one, is the impact that they have on business operations. So I always say to people, think of the individual, think of the position that you need a succession plan for, and think of the incumbent. If they were to leave today, which individual would have the largest impact on your day-to-day business operations? And finally, every organization has someone with a relatively unique skill set that may be very unique to not only the industry, but the organization. So understand if you have one of those individuals at the organization, and those people tend to be very difficult to replace. For example, we have an IT team at Sigma, and one of our IT individuals, our senior IT person, been with the company for 25 plus years. Not only is he a very senior technology developer, but he also has a great deal of experience in psychometric testing, which is one of our core competencies. So you can imagine that combination would be very difficult to find. And so we would go through that process, and the really important piece is not so much, the ratings are important, but the important piece of this process is actually the discussions that you have with the management team. So where do we agree? Where do we disagree? And I think out of those discussions, which you end up with hopefully a very clear picture you'll have a very clear picture of maybe 3 to 5 positions that are very critical to the organization that we need to do something about now. The challenge with that, though, is if you've never done a succession plan before, the easy trap is getting excited about it, and we need to have a succession plan for all these positions. We always tell organizations to start with one role, and this was where the focus comes. Start with a singular focus, make sure that we can demonstrate and communicate success, and then look to expand that with the rest of the organization. And I think focusing on those early successes can give us an opportunity to gain credibility for the process, and also communicating that, I think, can really get the buy-in from the rest of the organization. So now that we've really narrowed down our needs into one specific role, the most important or the most critical role at this point, the one that makes most sense to succession plan for, now we can really drill down and understand what's important for that specific role. And what we call that is our success profile. And in building that success profile, it should capture requirements of the position both today and, more importantly, the future. The critical pieces here are, imagine the individual in this role has probably been there 15, 20, 25 years. It's very difficult to separate Joe Smith from CFO. But it's really important when we're building this success profile to think of the role, the position, all by itself, separate from Joe. As you can imagine, if you think of an individual like this at your organization, when individuals have been in a role for a long time, a lot of times their role will bleed into other areas of the organization. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when we're building requirements for the role, think of the role by itself. In generating this information, we need to gather input from a variety of sources. Certainly the current incumbent is a really great resource. They've been doing the role for a significant length of time. That can both be a positive and a negative. The positive part is obviously they know the role better than anyone else. The negative is they base their knowledge of the role on what they've been doing for the last 20 to 25 years. What we want to do is we want to build this success profile for what's needed in the future. So you can see that the incumbent's perspective can only be one perspective in this process. A really great resource that's sometimes not used are that individual's direct reports. A lot of times they certainly have a great perspective and knowledge about what that role does because they've been working for that individual for several years. And they also have a little bit different perspective and an eye towards the future. So I think collectively, if we gather the information from our incumbent, their direct reports, and essentially the executive management team would consolidate that data together and come up with really the best fit for what that success profile looks like. And finally, the one really critical piece that weaves through this success profile is your organization's strategy. If we're building a success profile for the future, we need to know where the organization is going to go in the future. So for example, if your organization is planning for really aggressive growth over the next 3 to 5 years, you can imagine that what a chief marketing officer does today for a company of 50 employees is going to be very, very different if our company is going to be 500 employees 5 years from now. So that strategy piece is a really critical piece as we're building the success profile. So building the success profile itself, in terms of the steps, it's a relatively simple process. What we want to do from a pure logistics standpoint is for each success profile, we'd want the position, the individual in the position, their planned exit year if we know, and it's actually a great excuse to have the conversation with the incumbent if you haven't already. And the urgency, which is obviously really closely related to that exit date. We want to list the position requirements, and from a position criteria standpoint, it's best if we have a job description that we can at least use as a baseline. Certainly that may or may not be outdated. It will act as a baseline, and then we would gather input on from both the incumbent and their direct reports in terms of what would be needed for the future. And finally, again, just as a reminder, and I probably sound like a little bit of a broken record, but it's really critical to always remind yourself: are we thinking of the person? Or are we thinking of the role? So those normal requirements, so for example, your CFO obviously needs an accounting designation, maybe 15 plus years in finance, etc. That's the relatively easy part. But we all know that leadership is clearly determined by a variety of factors, including things like competency, character, and emotional intelligence that you've probably heard a lot more of within the last few years. Scientifically validated assessments, which is a core part of our business at Sigma, are an excellent way to measure current talent and actually inform discussions about what's important for the future. So we've talked about gathering information from the incumbent, from their direct reports, certainly from the senior management team, but assessments can really close that loop and really add a lot of objective data to the process. And finally, the key piece here is we've developed our success profile. We have a lot of really great information, and essentially this is the target. This is what we're shooting for as we develop successors into this role. But remember, this is not a static document. This is going to change maybe even on a year-to-year basis. So we recommend once you develop the document, actually put in your calendar, at least on an annual basis, to review and challenge the assumptions in that document. So now that we have our success profile, as I said, this is essentially the target where we want our successors to get to, the target that we're trying to hit. And now that we have this, we can start to, it helps us understand the talent we need. So that target is the talent we need. Next, we need to understand what we have in place today. So what does our internal candidate pool look like? A great first step in this stage is actually nominating successors. And it's actually, we think it's important to have a relatively simple process, because what we're trying to do is essentially develop, at risk of sounding a little bit institutional, a bit of an inventory of our talent and where everybody is in terms of their readiness and our confidence. And the nomination questionnaire that we use is simply two simple questions. How ready is the individual? And how much confidence do we have in their ability to perform in this role that they would move into. And once we have that information, we gather that on our whole team. This is not the point to differentiate between high potentials and non-high potentials. Once we have that information, we actually use that to inform and populate what we call our succession bench. And the succession bench is essentially a detailed overview of every individual that could possibly be a successor to a role. And as I said, this is not the time to differentiate whether they're high potentials or not. What we do with the succession bench is we actually divide them into A, B, and C categories, with the A being the most ready, B being maybe 3 to 5 years before they were ready, and our C-level folks would be 5 years or more before they would be ready to move into that position. The nice thing about this development bench is certainly having a clear overview of who can move into the role puts you probably ahead of most of your competitors because many people aren't doing succession planning as well as they should. But there's some other cool things that we can do with this. So for example, we can use the succession bench to drive our development decisions and essentially inform where and how we spend our development dollars. The other really neat thing about this is, if you remember, we've divided people into level A, level B, and level C. At a very high level, we would expect level C individuals, likely a little more junior in the firm, less experience and so forth. Doesn't mean that somebody that doesn't have a lot of tenure at the organization wouldn't be in there. But essentially, we never want people to stay in these levels for very long. So by monitoring movement between level A, level B, and level C, it really gives us an idea of how engaged our employees are. For example, if I was level A and I actually moved down levels, that should be a serious concern, especially if this individual had been a high potential. If I'm stagnant and I'm staying in a certain level for a long period of time, that can mean a lot of different things too. But essentially, there's likely an issue there, and it can identify maybe somebody that's thinking of leaving. So there's a lot of really neat things if we're monitoring movement between those levels. But essentially, having that high-level view of your succession bench, I think, can be really powerful in driving your decisions. And finally, what it does is it evaluates just essentially the general health of your bench for a specific role. So for example, in terms of best practices, what we like to do, what we shoot for, is having at least 3 individuals in the level A category. So at least 3 individuals that are in a position to move into that role if we needed them to. So that's sort of our target. That's our best case that we want to get to with all of our succession plans. Certainly not going to happen overnight, but it's a great goal, and it's also a great way to measure the success of your succession plan the more roles that you have with at least 3 individuals in that level. So now that we have that high-level inventory, it puts us in a position where we can now look at actual individual needs as they relate to the success profile that you developed. One of the simple, most accurate ways, and this probably doesn't come as a surprise that we'd say this given what we do, is to determine those development needs is through different types of assessments. And at Sigma, we actually offer some really neat and unique assessment tools that can inform those decisions and help drive development. We have the ability to measure competency on both a potential and a performance side. A very unique leadership character assessment that's been very successful for us of late. And finally, something that you've probably hearing more and more in the last 5 to 7 years is an assessment of emotional intelligence. So these are just a handful of a variety of assessments that we can use to help inform those decisions and really give your process that level of credibility and transparency that I think that can help move forward and get everybody's buy-in to the process. So the results from those assessments, as I said, provide a really clear and objective way to quantify those talent gaps. And I think that that's really important. We can use that data to populate individual succession profiles, highlight and monitor the gaps between where they're at and where they need to be to move into that level A. And as I said too, like with everything, don't treat these as static documents. These should be reviewed at least annually along with development plans. So it's one thing to identify gaps. The next level is actually having a development plan for us to fill those gaps and move them and advance them in their career and in their development. We have clients specifically that as part of their biannual senior leadership meetings, that they will review the development plans for their entire team as a group. And I think what this does is a couple things. It gives the process visibility. Secondly, I think it shows in actions, not just words, that the organization takes succession and the development of their high potentials very seriously. So the next piece is actually developing that talent. So we understand what the needs are, and the important part is how we execute that plan in essentially moving people to where they need to be in a position to be successful in the new role. You know, as I might have mentioned before, leadership development is really the engine that drives succession. So we've identified the talent we need through that success profile. We've used assessments to determine what our current talent has and their individual needs related to that target or that success profile. And the development stage is really where we execute the plan to fill those gaps and monitor the development progress. There are obviously many different methods and combinations of methods to fill those gaps, including executive coaching, stretch assignments, mentoring, etc. And we'll likely address this in future webinars, as it can be a multiple set of webinars all by itself. However, the key takeaway from this is your succession candidates, especially in a perfect world, all of your succession candidates in each level A, B, and C, essentially in a perfect world, all would have it, but at a minimum, those individuals in the level A or your high potentials should all have a development plan that is reviewed at least on an annual basis with the individual supervisor and likely, if it's not the same person, the individual that they're a successor for. So we've provided some structure and tools to simplify your succession process, and hopefully we've taken a little bit of the intimidation factor out of succession by adding that structure and giving you some tools. But it's an important point to note that we're not done yet. One very important thing that very few organizations, even those with a seemingly mature succession process, do not do well is measuring and communicating that progress. It's critical for succession planning. Frankly, any leadership development, HR, any initiative that you're doing to demonstrate value on an ongoing basis. This is going to make it easier to justify your budget when you're asking for more budget, and essentially, even more importantly, when you're asking for executives' time. Because I think you're going to ask them to invest their time in this process, and I think you need to demonstrate value to both them and the organization. And we do this essentially with our talent progress scorecard. Essentially looking for ways to measure value and communicate it in a way that makes sense and is meaningful to the entire organization. So a few of those things that are, I think, really critical to measure are Those critical positions that are filled internally, management positions that are filled internally, those obviously go hand in hand. If you have the data, if you understand what it costs the organization to hire somebody externally, connect that with your data. Obviously, it's very powerful to say from this year to last, we've actually increased the number of positions that we were able to fill internally by 30%. That's very, very powerful. What's even more powerful is we've increased those positions by 30%. We've actually saved the organization $275,000. So if you can connect the trend with an actual dollar value, that's going to have a significant impact in the credibility of your process. So very, very important. The next two pieces are average time your high potentials are in the same role and your high potential turnover. And it shouldn't really be a surprise that these are very highly correlated, so very closely related to each other. Your high potentials, typically speaking, are going to be more driven. They're going to give more, but they're also going to ask more from their role. So generally speaking, if high potentials are in a role for too long, and too long can be very different depending on that high potential, what happens is they start to look elsewhere. So if you're seeing a very high number of high potentials that are in the same role for a long period of time, you're likely going to see a very similar trend in high potentials leaving the organization. And that's very, very important. Again, from a cost perspective, if certain roles have a high training cost, attach that cost to your percentages. But essentially, we want these numbers to go down. So if average time hypos are in the same role has been 5.7 years, we obviously want to set goals and move that, and move those numbers lower and attach any dollar figure that we can. The next piece is those critical positions. As I said earlier, from a best practice standpoint or from a gold standard, we want in an ideal world to have at least 3 successors for every role. So we would identify all of our critical positions and essentially have how many of those positions have at least 3 plus successors. That's where we want to get to. As I said, have reasonable expectations and communicate reasonable expectations with this data. But that's where we want to get to, and that's what your leadership development processes are going to do. The next piece, and also closely related as well, is average years till individuals are ready. If we look at our talent bench today, and especially, for example, a smaller organization with maybe a younger staff, may have the average time to ready everybody be over 5 years. So obviously we want that average time to be a little more reasonable and a little more closer to a 3-year time frame. And finally with this, so these are just some examples of what you can measure, what you can communicate. What I would ask you to do, if you take nothing else from the webinar, is look at what you can measure easily today, identify those numbers, and essentially set a calendar date to measure them again 6 months from now, a year from now. Get in the habit, even if it's only one metric, get in the habit of looking for measurement and looking for ways to attach it to value and communicate it to your management team. So measuring and communicating early and often will ensure that you get the executive commitment and the resources that you need to expand the process. As I said, the focus of this is we want to start with one. We want to start small, have some early successes, communicate that value to the executive management team, and then we have data to support the investment in launching this across the organization. And that's going to both give the perception of success, which is important, but will also ensure that the process has success and the process continues to deliver value to the organization. So I hope you found this overview of the succession planning process helpful. I know it's a lot of information in a short period of time, but we have provided some additional resources. So if you take a look below the video, you can download our free succession planning guide that contains many of the resources that we talked about today. You can also find out more information about our succession planning services, and we have a really neat offering that revolves around a workshop series where we go into organizations and actually deliver deliver these succession planning services around a workshop and involve stakeholders. It's actually a really engaging and I think cost-effective series, so you can find out more information below the video there. And finally, you'll see my contact information below as well. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to call. We're always happy to help. And finally, look forward to hearing from you and hopefully seeing you at in a video again shortly. Thank you.